Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. We have a lot to talk about as usual. Before we get into it, if you like the show, please remember to give it a like and share with your family and friends and subscribe, of course. First, I want to begin with the upcoming State of the Union. It will be on February 24th, 2026, so that will be tomorrow. This is Trump's fourth State of the Union address, and this will be the first State of the Union in his second term. State of the Unions don't happen the first year of a presidency, so last year the speech was the joint session of Congress. It's just basically the only difference is the name, and the president doesn't say the state of our union is, so that's really the only difference. And I will cover what is going on, what happens next week, but I thought I'd give you all a heads up today. And that will be tomorrow, and Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger will be the one that responds to the State of the Union. She does the Democratic response, and then when Joe Biden was president, there was a Republican response. So we had major news last week. It broke. The Supreme Court has struck down much of President Trump's tariffs. They ruled in a 6-3 decision that the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as the IEPA, I believe that's what it was, it was not permitted. This justification was made because illegal drugs were coming into the United States and the trade deficit. That was the justification, and this was always very legally shaky because it may not have been it might not have been an emergency, and two, the statute doesn't say that you can use tariffs, as I will get to in a moment. This will not strike down all of the tariffs. For example, the ones on steel and aluminum remain. However, this will scrap the reciprocal tariffs that were announced on Liberation Day and the 25% tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico that were announced about a year ago. What was the ruling? In the majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, "The president asserts extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of an unlimited amount, duration, and scope." They also wrote, We hold the IEEPA does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. They said there was no statute to limit tariffs, and joined by him were the three liberal justices that were appointed by Obama and Biden, as well as Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch. And let me remind you, those two are Trump appointees. In their dissent, it was Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Brett Kavanaugh. Specifically, they wrote, "The court says nothing today about whether, if, and how so the government should go about returning the billions of dollars that it has collected from imports. Note, this is not a constitutional argument. This is instead a practical argument." My response to that is, if this was a concern that the administration had, they would not be able to return the money. That was something that was always a concern. Then they shouldn't have haphazardly implemented this policy to begin with. And yes, companies are suing to get their tariff money back from the U.S. Treasury, and all of tariff revenue last year, it was about $160 billion, and $133 billion of it was from Trump's overall tariffs. And it's something that has to be litigated, and it could take years, and the justices did not specifically rule on this. It will likely take years, as I said, and that's what the president said, and it could go on long after Trump has left office. You might think, well, what about us consumers that paid higher prices because of the tariffs that where companies passed on to us? Well, we're shit out of luck. So what happens next? Well, the president can try to use other laws, but he will face legal challenges as well. There's Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, but that's for national security purposes. I imagine the president might try to use that, but I believe there needs to be an investigation before he triggers it, and that could take time. There also is Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the U.S. President and trade representatives to determine whether the U.S. is being denied any rights and lawfully take action. So the President does have other avenues beside IEEPA, which, by the way, are not as clear as IEEPA was, even though that wasn't very clear to begin with. Trump said on Friday he will issue a 10% global tariff that will replace the ones that were struck down under Section 122. So that was another one that I did not mention. This can take effect for no more than 150 days, so that would take us to late July. Then on Saturday, he raised it to 15%, which is the highest that he can go under this order. So what do I think about all this? Well, this is good news, not the last bit, but this is good news. Generally, I'm against free trade. I believe we should only trade with our allies, but I do believe that Congress should be the one that makes the laws. And these tariffs were not consistent with what I explained, how we should only trade with our allies in Europe and in Asia. This was for everybody. And Congress has the power of taxation and they're the ones that make the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. So this is a good ruling, and besides, I don't think the administration is going to give up after this. They are going to try other things. They are trying other things. They could try to get these tariffs through Congress, although Congress has already rejected them. They just didn't have enough support to override President Trump's potential veto. So what can we learn from this? Well, just like the Vietnam Gulf of Tonkin resolution in the 1960s and the 2002 authorization of use of military force, which gave Congress's power of war over to the president, at least in Iraq, giving the executive branch authority that was originally given to the legislature is a bad idea. It's not a good idea. Our framers set it up this way. So Congress passed these laws a half century ago, and everyone who was a part of it is dead now, or if they're going to be dead very soon, and we are still living with the consequences of that. So the lesson is Congress should not hand over its power to the executive, and if it does, it cannot be indefinitely. It should be for a short and specific reason. As for tariffs, lower tariff rates will mean the Treasury, assuming, by the way, that they do end up dropping, the Treasury is going to pull in less revenue than expected. And remember, the tariffs were supposed to pay for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of last year. So now we're going to have an even bigger budget deficit in our public finances. And the government spending last year, despite the Doge, which didn't really cut anything, was a whopping $7 trillion. It was $100 billion higher than it was in 2024 under Joe Biden. And except for the pandemic, it was the highest government spending, the years of government spending in American history. And the budget deficit, it was slightly smaller. It came in at $1.7 trillion, or 5.4% of GDP, which, by the way, is enormous. It was $2 trillion, or 6% back in 2024. The IEEPA tariffs were about 60% of the $260 billion in tariff revenue, and it brought in $40 billion in the first 50 days of this year so far. So it was generating quite a bit of money. So this means the deficit is probably going to return back to 6% of GDP. Maybe not all the way. It could get to 5.8% or 5.9% depending on the economy and what's going on. But don't forget, Trump also wants to spend another $700 billion or $600 billion on the military. So there's really we're not making any progress to bringing our national deficit down. Speaking of our deficit, which is very reliant on the U.S. economy, the American economy took a dip toward the end of last year. It slowed at a rate of 1.4. Well, it was 1.4%. Last year was 2.2% overall. But as a reminder, inflation remains above 2.2%, which is at 2.7%, I believe, as of the last update that we got. So inflation is rising faster than our economy, which means that inflation is still outpacing growth. Not a good thing. It means output is not as high as prices are rising. The headline numbers look fine. However, the largest gains driving the growth of our economy is in the highest incomes, which is usually not a good sign. As with the economy overall, nobody has a crystal ball, and of course, some of the tariffs potentially going away could make future predictions even more murky, so I'm not going to attempt to do anything here. Last time I did that, I think it went terribly wrong. So I will say, though, that there has been very little job growth. We know that. So what is concerning, at least to me, is that we have a quote-unquote jobless boom. It's not really a boom, but it is a point where the economy is staying stable, but jobs are not growing as fast. And this lack of jobs, even though we're not in a recession, is quite unusual. The elephant in the room is artificial intelligence, and I think it remains to be seen if artificial intelligence is having an impact. I tend to think no, and the reason I say that is because it's still very new, and it can do some things. It can't do a lot of things. There's a lot of hesitancy as to the accuracy, and AI is yet to be profitable. It costs an enormous amount of money to run things like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and whatever the one that DeepSeek. It costs an enormous amount of money. I think that's what it's called. An enormous amount of money to run those, and it doesn't generate that much in revenue. So that's my thoughts on that matter. So I want to move on to the Save America Act, which, by the way, I'm only calling it that because that's what the name of the bill is. And I want to make a correction of sorts from my previous episode. We were going to lead with this until the Supreme Court made its ruling, and of course that had to come first. Instead, the Supreme Court made its ruling, and that's how it all went down. So I said in the last episode that Real ID is a form of an ID that you can use to register to vote, to prove that you are a U.S. citizen. However, it's more complicated than that. All in all, a Real ID is a proof of legal status. It's not a proof of citizenship. So all it can do is show that you're in the United States legally. It can't show that you're a U.S. citizen. There are 5 states. That would be Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Vermont, and Washington State that offer enhanced Real IDs that denote specific U.S. citizenship on the form or on the ID. So that would be a case where those would be Real ID. Those would be compliant with the Save America Act. However, in the other 45 states in the District of Columbia, that is not necessarily the case. For example, here in my home state of Pennsylvania, one of the documents required to get a Real ID is a birth certificate or a valid U.S. passport. And the only way that you would have those is if you are a U.S. citizen. So Pennsylvania's Real IDs do not explicitly show citizenship, but they are a de facto proof of citizenship. So I imagine here in Pennsylvania, because election law is up to states, that a Real ID would be a valid form of citizenship. However, that might not be the case in every state. So that was the confusion that I had last episode, and hopefully I didn't mislead anybody. Once again, this is very, very unlikely to get into law for 2 reasons. First, it has to pass the Senate, and while there are 50 votes for it, and J.D. Vance would approve it, so there are 51 votes. 60 are needed to break a Senate filibuster, and only 1 Democrat has said he will vote for it, and that is Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania. Voting will supposed to take place this week. I don't know if that's still going to happen, but the chances of it passing are very, very low. And if it somehow does, I imagine as soon as Trump signs it into law, there will be lawsuits, as I explained in the last episode. So the reasons for that, go check out last episode. However, there are some quirks in this legislation. It requires states to adopt these new rules within 30 days, and I think that is completely unreasonable. Usually these things need several months in order to be implemented, and I think it would be best if it didn't take place until after the midterm elections. Next, and this is the irony of it all, is that blue state residents are more likely to have a U.S. passport. And I'll put this up on screen. As you can see, states in the Northeast and the West Coast are more likely to have residents with passports, while states in the Midwest, the Rockies, and the South are less likely. Where do Democrats live? They're the ones that live on the East and West Coast, and as well as in various areas like Chicago and Denver in the middle of the country. This doesn't include birth certificates or Real ID in states that are compliant, but it shows that this could actually hurt Republicans, and if anything, Democrats might want to get on board with this. But that's the world we live in. It's a very ideological bill. It's a bill that doesn't have a lot of practical purpose. I mean, I definitely hope the Senate amends it, but I think it has a good foundation, but it is way too ideological to be effective. So also there is a requirement for in-person proof of citizenship, which means registration by mail, voter registration drives, online voter registration, and automatic voter registration would be completely eliminated, which would mean longer lines at the DMV, as if they aren't long enough already, and that would mean longer lines in government offices, like Board of Elections in various counties across the country. And as I said last episode, I still support this legislation. It's a step in the right direction, but I really hope the Senate amends it before it passes it, if it ever does, which it probably won't. So if that's the case, then it'll have to go back to the House to get reapproved, and then it would get sent back to the Senate. So really, if I were Democrats, I would amend this legislation and then pass it, because I think that is the way to go. Most Americans support voter ID, at least to present it to vote. I bet you most Americans do not support the Save America Act the way it is right now. So if they can make amends and then get it passed, then they could take some of the credit for passing the bill. And we could go from there. I don't think it's actually going to help or hurt them, but it's something that they could do. So let's move on. I was reading some very alarming news in the media, and that's Trump might use his power as President of the United States to shut down Visa and MasterCard in countries that he has political disagreements with. So, for example, the United Kingdom was cited as one. 95% of all transactions use Visa or MasterCard in the United Kingdom, which, of course, is one of our biggest allies. big banks and executives, they've been meeting for quite a few years about how to move away from American-based companies. However, they're trying to accelerate these plans in the wake of the Trump administration. But even if they do, it's still going to take years. Trump will be out of office before they are done. Where did this come from? Well, let's go back into history a little bit. Exactly 4 years ago, if you weren't aware, the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is tomorrow. It is on February 24th. That is the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. That is the anniversary, which will be 4 years ago tomorrow. Anyway, Russia attacked Ukraine, and Visa and MasterCard were suspended. The operation suspended in Russia on March 5th, 2022. And they said, once complete, all transactions initiated with Visa cards issued in Russia will no longer work outside the country, and any Visa cards issued by financial institutions outside of Russia will no longer work within the Russian Federation. And needless to say, that caused a lot of chaos in Russia. In August of last year, the Russian Central Bank announced that expired cards would continue to operate in Russia. They're now trying to move away from that. So Trump could end up doing that to other countries, and you might wonder, well, why would he do that? So he would do that because over things like Greenland. He would say, if you don't give me Greenland, then I'm going to shut down your entire economy. And you think Visa and MasterCard, especially in places where they're used almost exclusively, imagine if you were a person and you didn't have access to your card. And then that was everybody. So you wouldn't be able to pay your bills, you wouldn't be able to go to the gas station, you wouldn't be able, if you didn't have a bank nearby, you won't be able to pay for anything. And you think that multiply that by thousands, millions of people, that you can shut down an entire economy overnight. So that is that. Hopefully that doesn't happen. I don't think Trump would do that. I think that's even a step too far, but you never know. So this is not really political, but President Trump reacted to the passing of Reverend Jesse Jackson on Truth Social. He wrote, "The Reverend Jesse Jackson is dead at 81. I knew him well long before becoming president. He was a good man with a lot of personality, grit, and street smarts. He was very gregarious, someone who truly loved people." All right, let's pause here. This should have been the end of the statement, but it wasn't. Let's continue. "Despite the fact that I am falsely and consistently called a racist by the scoundrels and lunatics on the radical left, Democrats all in all, it was always my pleasure to help Jesse along the way. I provided office space for him and his Rainbow Coalitions for years in the Trump office building on 40 Wall Street, responded to his request for helping in getting criminal justice reform passed and signed when no other president would even try, single-handedly pushed and passed long-term funding for historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, which Jesse loved, but also other presidents would not do." All right, we'll pause again. Funding to HBCUs has happened for decades. It dropped in the years after the Great Recession, but then again, every college and university, they lost funding, a lot of funding because of the recession. States and local governments cut a lot of funding to colleges as a way to save money. But I'm pretty sure Biden also funded them really an exorbitant amount, in my opinion, with the American Rescue Plan. But anyway, Trump continues. Responded to Jesse's support for opportunity zones, the single most successful economics development package yet approved for black businessmen and women, and much more. Jesse was a force of nature like few others before him. He had much to do with the election without the acknowledgement or credit of Barack Hussein Obama, a man Jesse could not stand. He loved his family greatly, and to them I send my deepest sympathies and condolences. Jesse will be missed. President Donald J. Trump. So, if you notice, Trump didn't mention a single thing that Jesse Jackson accomplished other than helping get Obama elected, which he doesn't consider to be a good thing. And instead of listing all of Jesse Jackson's, who was a reverend, all of his accomplishments, he lists his own accomplishments, which, what a narcissist. Not to mention, he didn't mention how Jesse Jackson led boycotts, fought in the civil rights movement, which Trump did not do. He ran for president twice. His soft power within the Democratic Party, his Rainbow Coalition, and I guess that was passively mentioned, his Medal of Freedom that he received, 40 honorary degrees, and a negotiation of a release of hostages in places like Syria. He was an incredible man, and Trump didn't mention any of that. And I'm not surprised, but I am disappointed. So that's all I have to say about that. Next, I want to turn our attention to Cuba. The story of Cuba is, in the last half century, is worth a podcast of its own. Instead, we're going to focus on what's going on here and now. And boy, oh boy, has a lot happened. There's a lot of problems going on there. This has kind of flown under the radar of a lot of Americans. I'm not going to mince words here. Cuba is collapsing, mostly because they're running out of fuel. And in fact, they've already run out of jet fuel and they can't fly their planes. So nobody take a trip to Cuba. And I'm warning you, do not go to Cuba because you're not going to be able to come back. They're also running out of electricity and their tourism industry has completely collapsed because nobody wants to go there anymore. So you might wonder, well, how did we get here? Cuba has never really been able to function as an independent nation. What do I mean? Prior to the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the island was a U.S. puppet state. Then, from the Eisenhower administration to the Clinton administration, it was supported by the Soviet Union. And naturally, during the Cold War, having enemy territory 90 miles off the coast of Florida was not a great thing. It was deeply troubling. And we had the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, I believe. Maybe it was 62. Historians can correct me. Then we had the period after the USSR fell. Cuba was all alone, like it is now. They were alone for almost 10 years. They were still led by Castro. So they survived before, although this time does feel a little bit different. There was a lot of anticipation at that time that Cuba was going to fall at any moment. And indeed, it never did. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela began to send oil to the country when he came to power in 1999. And that was basically the state of things for the 25 years that followed until January of 2026, because that's when Maduro was captured. Once Trump captured Maduro, oil shipments completely stopped. Mexico had been providing some of the oil, but Trump threatened tariffs on any country that was giving oil to Mexico or to Cuba, so that stopped too. And Cuba basically has no more imports. So that's the state of play at the moment. And you might think, well, why Cuba? Well, unlike most areas, Trump doesn't want to annex Cuba. I wouldn't want to annex Cuba either. But he has looked at the last 70 years of failure to remove the Castro regime and now the regime led by Miguel Diaz-Canel, and he wants to be able to do it. This could be a huge accomplishment, and if Trump could topple the Cuban government and then I'd probably be someone who approves. Like I would be very, it wouldn't change how I would vote, but I would be very pleased with Trump and his presidency, at least for a short period of time. Cubans in South Florida, of course, will be thrilled, which is a core part of the GOP base. They're probably, at least in part, why Florida is not a swing state anymore. You have Marco Rubio, who is also invested in this. There's a personal and political aspect to this. His family came from Cuba before the communists took over, and his whole career has been centered around his Cuban-American heritage. He could be part of toppling the regime, and that would give him and J.D. Vance a huge leg up over any Republican rivals in 2028. So obviously, I think for Trump, it's more legacy-based, while for Rubio and maybe Vance, it's more political or personal. So I'll state the obvious. Trump sees a business opportunity in Cuba. If American companies could move to Cuba and then turn it into a tropical paradise where money's growing on the trees and the streets are paved with gold, they would. Like the Bahamas, there could be a lot of people going to Cuba for their winter vacations. And also, many people in South Florida would want to return to Cuba or be reunited with family in Cuba, so there's that aspect as well. Lastly, it would be nice not to have refugees coming across the Caribbean and crashing onto Florida beaches. Until Obama's administration, we had a wet foot, dry foot policy where basically if you were caught at sea, you were deported back to Cuba, but anyone who made it to the U.S. mainland and then they were caught, they were allowed to apply for permanent residency. It was one of the few exceptions for illegal immigration that we had at that period of time. Obama ended the policy in 2017, and then Trump and Biden never reinstated it. So now they are subject to deportation just like everybody else. As for the political aspect of this, Democrats, including Obama, they were more friendly to Cuba. Republicans are more hostile, and that's because of the Cuban-American base. And by the way, this is why Bernie would have never won the swing state of Florida, or the former swing state of Florida in 2016 or 2020, because he loves Fidel Castro, he praises him, he talks about their literacy program, and how they thought people were going to rise up against Fidel Castro, and they didn't, and Bernie thinks that's great, and he wants to bring that here. So that is why Bernie will never, ever win the state of Florida if he runs for president again, which I think he will, so that's not going to happen. So when Gavin Newsom becomes president in 2029, hopefully that doesn't happen, but if it does, then we might end up softening our relationships with Cuba, because now that Florida's not a swing state anymore, I expect Democrats in the coming years to abandon trying to win over that Cuban-American base that is there. Unless Trump has already built 6 golf courses in Havana by then that is probably what we will do. We'll work with the Cuban government more when a Democrat is in office as opposed to working against them. So hopefully it's done in a tidy way, and this doesn't turn into a civil war where the country dissolves into a million pieces, but we'll have to wait and see. And then lastly, we don't have time to get into this episode. We're already ran way over, but we could be at war with Iran in the coming weeks. There has been a military buildup in the Persian Gulf, much like there was before we captured Maduro. And if there is a war, we'll talk about that next episode along with the State of the Union. Maybe if Trump wants to be really audacious, I don't think he will, but he could talk about the war during the State of the Union. The last president that went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1941 for war on Japan. I don't think Trump is going to say, give me a declaration of war. I don't think that's going to happen, but you never know. I didn't think we would be here where we are now, but that is definitely interesting. It would be very historical if that's what he's looking for. So that is it for now. Thank you for tuning in. Please let me know your thoughts, as always, in the comments below. Yes, we're back in here at the greenhouse again. It's snowing. Please stay warm out there, and let me know your thoughts as always. And see you next week. Bye-bye.